Okay, so I'm going to run through very briefly how to use correlation in Excel. And there's two different ways I want to sort of walk you through how to do this. The first is to use the correlation function. And so you can just type into any cell equals, and then correl is the function code that Excel uses. And it will ask you for two different arrays. And so in this particular project, I'm going to look at a correlation of trade and democracy scores from Freedom House. So the Freedom House provides a measure of how democratic countries are, whether they're free or not free, where higher scores represent countries that are less free and lower scores represent countries that are not free. And I also have trade data, which is, I think, measured in billions. All of this data comes from a replication project I did for an article trying to explain corruption perception index scores from Transparency International for 1996. So the data is a bit dated, but it works really well as an example. So with this correlation function, I just need to tell Excel where to look for those two different arrays. And so I'm going to be looking here in column G for the corruption data, and I'll just highlight G2, and I'll just drag down because I've only got about 50 cases here. 51, and then it's highlighted. And then I use a comma, and that shifts me over to the second array. What's the other variable that we're going to use for this correlation? And I can grab the trade data, and here I'll just type it in. So I'm starting in J2, and I'll hit colon until I want to go all the way down to J51. And that will highlight that column J all the way down so that they match up. Okay, so I'll close my formula up by adding a close parentheses and hit enter, and I get a correlation value for those two variables of negative 0.413. So as the Freedom House score goes up, right, as sort of the countries become less free, they tend to trade less, so they're moving against each other. One goes up, the other goes down. Which maybe makes sense intuitively if we know much about authoritarian regimes. So that's one of the ways that we can run correlation in Excel. The second way is using the data analysis tool, which is something that you can add into Excel using their add-ins pack. And I have a video on how to do that if you haven't done that yet. And there's an option for correlation. But before we can do that, there's a little quirk about Excel in that it asks for a single input range. And if I tell it, by clicking this little arrow here, that I want to look at my trade data, and I want to look at my democracy data in column G, I can click on it, but it unselects what I had just done. So select column G. Go back and see if we can pick up, by holding down Control, the stuff from column J. Now, this would work to highlight things in Excel, but when I go and click OK and try and run that, I'm going to get an error message. It says correlation input range must be a continuous reference. That's not the most intuitive error message, but what it's saying is Excel is looking for a single block, and for that, Excel wants those variables that you're going to be correlating to be sitting right next to each other, so you can select them all at once. It doesn't like hitting Control and dragging to get more. So for this, I'm going to simply pick up the democracy column, and I'm going to start a new sheet, and I'll just paste it into that new sheet. And I'll come back and I'll get my trade variable, column J, and I'll pick it up with my Control C for copy, and I'll bring it over and Control V for paste. And now I've got them side by side right next to each other. And when I go and run my correlation with the data analysis tab, I can tell it I want both of these variables just like that. Okay, so once I've selected the two variables that I want to correlate, I am going to tell Excel there's labels in the first row so that it doesn't try to treat those as numbers, but recognizes that they're labels and will actually use them to communicate a better table. I can tell it I want an output range specified. And so for this, I want it to put my results right here in E1. And then I can click OK. And so what it does is it gives me this little table of correlation results where it goes through and correlates everything that I gave it. So if it had multiple variables, 3, 4, 5, it would have more columns and more cells. When democracy is correlated with democracy in the variables, it turns out it's a perfect positive correlation. So it gets a value of 1. Same is what happens when trade is correlated with trade. So that's this column right here. Okay, that's not all that surprising or useful. But when we correlate democracy with trade, we get the value negative 0.413, which I believe is the same thing that we got when we ran our analysis earlier using the formula. So both are different ways to get that correlation value. But if you've worked much with statistics, there's one more piece of information that you probably want to have, and that is the p-value, right? To tell us whether or not that correlation coefficient is statistically significant, is likely to exist out there in a larger world, or whether it's something that we can explain with simple random sampling variation. Excel does not have a method for determining if something is statistically significant, for generating a p-value for Pearson's correlation. So we have two different strategies that we can use to get that information. One of those strategies is to compare our result, negative 0.413, with a critical value. And so this is how we used to determine statistical significance for statistical results before we had access to computers that could calculate precise p-values. There were these tables that we could go to and look up. And the way that these tables work is that you figure out what your degrees of freedom are, n-2 in this case. So I have 51 cases. I'm going to use a degree of freedom of 49 for that. And so I just scroll down and find 49. Well, it's not here, it's 50. So I'll just go with that one. And I'm going to look for a 0.05 threshold, alpha level of statistical significance. If you've watched any videos I've done elsewhere, I refer to this as the threshold of weirdness. What's that point at which we cross from this could just be random sampling variation into this is an unusual thing that's probably more than just random sampling variation. And so if we were interested in using 0.05, which is a common standard threshold for that, and we follow that down to our column where we have 50 here, what that's telling us is that any correlation value that is greater than 0.273, or I guess negative 0.273, because it would go in either direction, right? That correlation coefficients, 0 is no relationship, and as they approach 1 or negative 1, the relationships are getting stronger. So anything that's beyond that is going to have a p-value less than 0.05. And so based on this table, we could use that critical value to go back and evaluate the result we got when we did our analysis and say, wow, you know, our result is further out, it's a stronger relationship than critical value, therefore our result is statistically significant. The other thing that we could do to try to get at this is to just use an online tool to calculate p-values. And for that, I have just simply Googled, which is what you do when you need to find something today. And socialstats.com has a p-value calculator for Pearson's R, where you just tell it what your Pearson's R value is. So in this case, my Pearson's R value is negative 0.41344, and the size of my sample. So I'm looking at 50 cases. And what's the significance level that I want? 0.05. And when I click calculate, it goes through and tells me that my p-value is 0.0028. So again, very, very small, beyond that threshold of 0.05 that we set. Very likely that this result is so unusual relative to the null hypothesis of no pattern, no relationship between these variables, that it's unlikely to be the result of sampling variation, and is much more likely to be the result of an actual pattern that's out there in the world. So we can reject the null hypothesis of no relationship and conclude that there probably is a relationship between democracy levels of countries and trade. So this is just a really quick way of sort of jumping in and trying to get at correlation and interpret correlation using the tools that are available to us from Excel.